Conscience calls the self of Dasein forth from its lostness in the they. The self summoned remains indifferent and empty in its what. The call passes over what Dasein, initially and for the most part, understands itself as in its interpretation in terms of taking care. And yet the self is unequivocally and unmistakably reached. Not only is the call meant for one who is summoned, without regard to his person, the caller, too, remains in a striking indefiniteness. It not only fails to answer questions about name, status, origin, and repute, but also leaves not the slightest possibility of making the call familiar for an understanding of Dasein with a worldly orientation. On the other hand, it by no means disguises itself in the call. The caller of the call-in, this belongs to its phenomenal character, absolutely distances itself from any kind of becoming familiar. It goes against its kind of being to be drawn into any consideration and talk. The peculiar indefiniteness and indefinability of the caller is not nothing, but rather a positive distinction. It lets us know that the caller uniquely coincides with summoning to, that it wants to be heard only as such, and not be chattered about any further. But is it then not suitable to the phenomenon to leave unasked the question of who the caller is? Yes, for the existential way of listening to the factical call of conscience, but not for the existential analysis of the facticity of calling and the existentiality of hearing. But is it even necessary to keep explicitly raising the question of who is calling? Is this not answered for Dasein just as unequivocally as the question about the one who is summoned in the call? Dasein calls itself in conscience. This understanding of the caller may be more or less awakened in factically hearing the call. However, ontologically it is not enough to answer that Dasein is the caller and the one summoned at the same time. When Dasein is summoned, is it not there, in another way from that in which it does the calling? Is it perhaps the ownmost potentiality of being that functions as the caller? The call is precisely something that we ourselves have neither planned nor prepared for, nor willfully brought about. It calls against our expectations and even against our will. On the other hand, the call, without doubt, does not come from someone else who is with me in the world. The call comes from me and yet over me. These phenomenal findings are not to be explained away. They were also taken as the point of departure for interpreting the voice of conscience as an alien power entering hierin regendin Dasein. Continuing in this direction of interpretation, one supplies an owner for the power thus localized, or else one takes that power as a person God, making himself known. Conversely, one tries to reject this interpretation of the caller as the expression of an alien power, and at the same time to explain conscience away, biologically. Both interpretations hastily pass over the phenomenal finding. Such procedures are made easier by the unspoken, but ontologically guiding, dogmatic thesis that what is, that is, anything so factual as the call must be objectively present. What cannot be demonstrated as objectively present just is not at all. As opposed to this methodical hastiness, we want not only to hold on to the phenomenal findings in general, the fact that the call, coming from me and over me, reaches me, but also to the implication that this phenomenon is here delineated ontologically as a phenomenon of Dasein. The existential constitution of this being can offer the sole guideline for the interpretation of the kind of being of the it, that call. Does our previous analysis of the constitution of the being of Dasein show a way of making ontologically intelligible the kind of being of the caller, and thus also that of calling? The fact that the call is not explicitly brought about by me, but rather, it calls, does not justify looking for the caller in a being unlike Dasein. Dasein, after all, always exists factically. It is not an unattached self-projection, but its character is determined by thrownness as a fact of the being that it is, and thus determined, it has always already been delivered over to existence and remains so constantly. The facticity of Dasein is, however, essentially distinguished from the factuality of something objectively present. Existing Dasein does not encounter itself as something objectively present within the world. But neither is thrownness attached to Dasein as an inaccessible quality that is of no importance to its existence. As thrown, Dasein has been thrown into existence. It exists as a being that has to be as it is and can be. That it factically is might be concealed with regard to its why, but the that it is has itself been disclosed to Dasein. The thrownness of this being belongs to the disclosedness of the there, and reveals itself constantly in each and every attunement. Attunement brings Dasein, more or less explicitly and authentically, before its that it is, and as the being that it is, has to be as a potentiality of being. But for the most part, mood closes off thrownness. Dasein flees from thrownness to the relief that comes with the supposed freedom of the they-self. We characterize this flight as a fleeing in the face of the uncanniness that fundamentally determines individualized being in the world. Uncanniness reveals itself authentically in the fundamental attunement of anxiety, and as the most elemental disclosedness of thrown Dasein, it confronts being in the world with the nothingness of the world about which it is anxious in the anxiety about its own most potentiality of. What if Dasein, finding itself in the ground of its uncanniness, were the caller of the call of conscience? Nothing speaks against this, but all the phenomena that were set forth up to now in characterizing the caller and its calling speak for it. In its who, the caller is definable by nothing nichts, worldly. It is Dasein in its uncanniness, primordially thrown being in the world as not at home, the naked that in the nothingness nichts of the world. The caller is unfamiliar to the everyday they-self. It is something like an alien voice. What could be more alien to the they, lost in the manifold world of its heedfulness, than the self individualized to itself in uncanniness thrown into nothingness? It calls, and yet gives the heedfully curious ears nothing to hear that could be passed along and publicly spoken about. But what should Dasein even report from the uncanniness of its thrown being? What else remains for it than its own potentiality of being revealed in anxiety? How else should it call than by summoning to this potentiality of being about which it is solely concerned? The call does not report any facts, it calls without uttering anything. The call speaks in the uncanny mode of silence. And it does this only because, in calling the one summoned, it does not call him into the public idle chatter of the they, but calls him back from that to the reticence of his existent potentiality of being. When the caller reaches one who is summoned, it does so with a cold assurance that is uncanny and by no means obvious. Wherein lies the basis for this assurance, if not in the fact that Dasein, individualized to itself in its uncanniness, is absolutely unmistakable to itself? What is it that takes away from Dasein so radically the possibility of misunderstanding itself from some other direction and failing to recognize itself, if not the abandonment Verlassenheit in being delivered over Überlassenheit to itself? Uncanniness is the fundamental kind of being in the world, although it is covered over in everydayness. Dasein itself calls as conscience from the ground of this being. The it calls me is an eminent kind of discourse of Dasein. The call attuned by anxiety first makes possible for Dasein its project upon its almost potentiality of being. The call of conscience, existentially understood, first makes known what was simply asserted before. Uncanniness pursues Dasein and threatens its self-forgetful lostness. The statement that Dasein is at the same time the caller and the one summoned has now lost its empty formal character and its obviousness. Conscience reveals itself as the call of care. The caller is Dasein, anxious in thrownness in its already being in, about its potentiality of being. The one summoned is also Dasein, called forth to its own most potentiality of being in its already ahead of itself. And what is called by the summons, out of falling prey to the they already being together with the world taken care of, is Dasein. The call of conscience, that is, conscience itself, has its ontological possibility in the fact that Dasein in the ground of its being is care. Thus we need not resort to powers unlike Dasein, especially since recourse to these is so far from explaining the uncanniness of the call that it rather annihilates it. In the end, does not the reason for the far-fetched explanations of conscience lie in the fact that we have not looked long enough to establish the phenomenal findings regarding the call, and have tacitly presupposed Dasein, coincidentally, to be in some kind of ontological determination or indetermination? Why should we look to alien powers for information before we have made sure that, in starting our analysis, we have not given too low an assessment of the being of Dasein, that is, as an innocuous subject occurring somehow, endowed with personal consciousness beouf three sane? And yet if the caller, who is no one viewed from the perspective of the world, is interpreted as a power, this seems to be an unprejudiced recognition of something objectively ascertainable. But rightly considered, this interpretation is only a flight from conscience, a way out for Dasein along which it slips away from the thin wall that separates the they, so to speak, from the uncanniness of its being. This interpretation of conscience pretends to recognize the call in the sense of a universally binding voice that does not speak just subjectively. Better yet, this universal conscience gets exalted to a world conscience, which still has the phenomenal character of an it and no one, yet which speaks there in the individual subject as this indefinite something. But what else is this public conscience than the voice of the they? Dasein can only come up with the dubious idea of a world conscience, because at bottom conscience is, in its essence, in each instance mine. It is this not only in the sense that one's own most potentiality of being is always summoned, but because the call comes from the being that I myself always am. With this interpretation of the caller, which absolutely follows the phenomenal character of calling, the power of conscience is not diminished and made merely subjective. On the contrary, the inexorability and unequivocal quality of the call thus becomes free for the first time. The objectivity of the summons thus is first justified when the interpretation leaves it its subjectivity, which of course denies the they-self its dominance. Nevertheless, this interpretation of conscience as the call of care will be countered by the question of whether any interpretation of conscience can stand up if it distances itself so far from natural experience. How is conscience as that which summons us to our own most potentiality of being supposed to function when it, after all, initially and for the most part, reprimands and warns? Does conscience speak in so indefinite and empty a way about our own most potentiality often? Does it not rather speak definitely and concretely in relation to failures and omissions which have already occurred for which we intended? Does the alleged summons come from a bad conscience or a good one? Does conscience give us anything positive at all? Does it not function, rather, only critically? Such second thoughts are incontestably justified. We can demand in any interpretation of conscience that, 1. should recognize in it the phenomenon in question, as it is experienced daily. But to do justice to this demand does not mean that the vulgar, ontic understanding of conscience must be recognized as the first court of appeal for an ontological interpretation. But on the other hand, the second thoughts we are having are premature as long as the analysis of conscience to which they pertain has not reached its goal. Up to now, we have tried solely to trace conscience as a phenomenon of Dasein back to the ontological constitution of this being. This served to prepare the task of making conscience intelligible as an attestation in Dasein of its almost potentiality of being. But what conscience attests to becomes completely definite only when we have stated with sufficient clarity what quality the listening must have that genuinely corresponds to calling. The authentic understanding, following, the call is not an addition annexed to the phenomenon of conscience, a process that can either occur or else be lacking. The complete experience of conscience can only be grasped from understanding the summons together with it. If the caller and the one who is summoned are themselves at the same time one's own Dasein, then a definite kind of being of Dasein lies in every failure to hear the call or in a mishearing of oneself. Viewed existentially, an unattached call from which nothing ensues is an impossible fiction. That nothing ensues means something positive with regard to Dasein. Thus only an analysis of understanding the summons can lead to an explicit discussion of what the call gives to understand. But only with our foregoing, general ontological characterization of conscience is the possibility given to comprehend existentially conscience's call of guilty. All interpretations and experiences of conscience agree that the voice of conscience somehow speaks of guilt, schuld,